Australia ranks among the most prosperous and advanced nations on Earth. Its citizens enjoy exceptional standards of education, healthcare, and income, all wrapped in a famously relaxed culture that makes everyday life genuinely enviable. The country's 5 biggest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, consistently appear among the world's most livable places, measured across factors like safety, services, environment, and opportunity. The result? Australian men now live to around 81 years on average, and women to roughly 85. But none of this was guaranteed. Rewind just 150 years to 1870, and the average newborn could only expect to survive until their mid-30s. Go back a little further still, and the people living on this land weren't enjoying opportunity. They were enduring punishment. For a significant stretch of its early European history, Australia functioned as a dumping ground for Britain's convicted criminals, shipped to the edge of the known world to carve out settlements in an alien and brutal landscape. So how does a place go from being a continental prison to one of humanity's most coveted addresses? That transformation is one of history's most remarkable stories. 65,000 years before any of that, long before Europeans ever set eyes on it, Australia had been home to human beings for roughly 65,000 years. The first arrivals crossed from Southeast Asia during the last ice age, gradually spreading across the enormous landmass from the tropical islands in the far north all the way down to Tasmania in the south. These were the ancestors of today's Aboriginal peoples, who over tens of thousands of years developed into more than 500 distinct nations, each with its own language, traditions, and territory. For generation after generation, life on this continent unfolded largely undisturbed, until the outside world came knocking. The Europeans arrive. During the great age of oceanic exploration spanning the late 1400s through the 1600s, European sailors fanned out across the globe chasing trade, conquest, and discovery. As their maps filled in, an old philosophical idea gained new currency. Surely the planet needed a large southern landmass to balance all the territory in the north. They called it Terra Australis, the southern land. The Dutch were the first Europeans to actually find it. In 1606, navigator Willem Janszoon made the first recorded European landing on Australian soil. Over the following decades, other Dutch explorers filled in pieces of the coastline. Dirk Hartog at Shark Bay in 1616, Jan Carstens charting the southwest in 1622, and most notably Abel Tasman in 1642, who reached the island now bearing his name, as well as New Zealand and Fiji. The Dutch labeled the place New Holland on their maps, but never seriously considered settling it. The spice routes of Asia were far more profitable, and this new land offered no obvious commercial reward. Interest faded for nearly a century. Captain Cook changes everything. The man who reignited Europe's fascination with the southern continent was Britain's Captain James Cook. Between 1768 and 1779, Cook conducted 3 voyages across the Pacific that reshaped the known world. In April 1770, he became the first European to reach Australia's eastern coast, coming ashore at a spot his ship's botanist found so rich in plant specimens that they named it Botany Bay. After a week exploring the area and attempting contact with local Aboriginal people, Cook sailed north, claimed the entire eastern coastline for Britain, and called it New South Wales. Returning home in 1771, Cook reported back on the region's potential for settlement. He never made it back. He was killed in Hawaii in 1780 during his 3rd voyage. But the seed had been planted. America's loss becomes Australia's origin story. What actually forced Britain's hand was a political catastrophe on the other side of the world. In 1775, Britain's 13 American colonies rose up in armed revolt. 8 years later, they had won their independence and become the United States. For Britain, this was devastating not just as a territorial loss, but as a logistical one. For over a century, the American colonies had served as a convenient destination for convicted criminals sentenced to transportation. With that option gone, the British government needed somewhere new to send them. Australia was the answer. In May 1787, 11 ships known as the First Fleet departed Britain, carrying around 1,400 people, convicts, marines, and officials. They arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788, but the site proved unsuitable. Commander Arthur Phillip sailed a short distance north and discovered a stunning natural harbor. He named the settlement Sydney Cove, and with that, the European history of Australia formally began. America's loss becomes Australia's origin story. What actually forced Britain's hand was a political catastrophe on the other side of the world. In 1775, Britain's 13 American colonies rose up in armed revolt. 8 years later, they had won their independence and become the United States. For Britain, this was devastating not just as a territorial loss, but as a logistical one. For over a century, the American colonies had served as a convenient destination for convicted criminals sentenced to transportation. With that option gone, the British government needed somewhere new to send them. Australia was the answer. In May 1787, 11 ships known as the First Fleet departed Britain, carrying around 1,400 people, convicts, marines, and officials. They arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788, but the site proved unsuitable. Commander Arthur Phillip sailed a short distance north and discovered a stunning natural harbor. He named the settlement Sydney Cove, and with that, the European history of Australia formally began. A catastrophe for Aboriginal Australia. The expansion of European settlement was devastating for the people who already lived there. Despite British intentions to establish cooperative relations with Aboriginal communities, the settlers unknowingly carried diseases against which Indigenous Australians had no immunity after 60,000 years of isolation. A smallpox outbreak in April 1789 killed roughly half the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region. Among the British colonists, there was just one fatality. Waves of measles, influenza, typhoid, and tuberculosis continued decimating communities throughout the 19th century. Beyond disease, cultural misunderstandings sparked repeated conflict. Aboriginal communities hunted animals across traditional lands, livestock included, which settlers viewed as theft. Desperate for communication, colonists sometimes kidnapped Aboriginal men and women and forced them to serve as interpreters. One such person was Bennelong, who became a go-between for the Eora people and the Sydney settlers. Another, Bungaree, voluntarily served as a cultural liaison and in 1802 joined explorer Matthew Flinders' circumnavigation of the continent, making him the first Australian-born person to sail around the country. Well-meaning policies, schools, missions, reserve land, failed to stop the relentless encroachment on Aboriginal territory. What followed was a prolonged series of frontier conflicts stretching from the late 1700s into the early 20th century. Aboriginal communities fought back by raiding farms and driving off settlers. Settlers retaliated with massacres. The violence on both sides was systematic and brutal, and its consequences continue to be reckoned with today. Gold, growth, and rebellion. As the 19th century progressed, free settlers poured in from Britain, Ireland, and increasingly from continental Europe. By the 1840s, calls for democratic self-governance were growing louder, and local parliaments began to replace autocratic colonial rule. Then, in 1851, gold was discovered near Bathurst in New South Wales. The effects were staggering. Within a decade, Australia's population exploded from 430,000 to over 1.1 million as prospectors flooded in from Britain, America, China, and beyond. The gold rush was transformative, but it also bred resentment. When easily accessible deposits ran dry, miners who'd come up empty-handed faced heavy-handed taxation and little political representation. In December 1854, that frustration boiled over at the Eureka Stockade, where miners barricaded themselves against colonial authorities and fought back. They were defeated militarily, but won the battle of public opinion. Their subsequent acquittal in court marked a turning point in Australian values, cementing the idea that fairness and equality before the law were non-negotiable. A broader economic boom followed through the second half of the 19th century, bringing urbanization, railways, and consumer culture. But prosperity wasn't universal. Rural poverty pushed some into lawlessness. The bushrangers, Australia's equivalent of Wild West outlaws, robbed stagecoaches, farms, and banks across the countryside. The most famous of them, Ned Kelly, became something of a folk legend, his story woven permanently into the national mythology. By the 1890s, the boom had collapsed. Economic depression, rising unemployment, and labor disputes gave birth to the trade union movement and hardened a distinctly Australian identity, one tied to Britain by heritage, but increasingly convinced it needed to chart its own course. A nation is born. On January 1st, 1901, the 6 separate Australian colonies federated into a single nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. Edmund Barton was sworn in as the first Prime Minister. One of the new nation's earliest acts was deeply troubling: the White Australia policy, which blocked non-European immigration, particularly from Asia. Framed as a tool of national cohesion, it was in reality a system of racial exclusion that would persist for decades. War forges a national identity. Australia's entry into the First World War alongside Britain marked a turning point in how the country saw itself. In the 1915 Gallipoli campaign, Australian and New Zealand troops, known as Anzacs, attempted to seize the Dardanelles from the Ottoman Empire. The campaign failed at enormous cost, but the courage displayed by Australian soldiers in the face of catastrophic odds became one of the defining pillars of national identity. By war's end in 1918, over 324,000 Australians had served overseas, with 60,000 killed and 150,000 wounded, the highest casualty rate proportionally among all Allied forces. The interwar years brought Dominion status from Britain in 1931, but also economic depression. In dark times, Australians found pride elsewhere. The airline Qantas was founded in 1920. Aviator Charles Kingsford Smith completed the first trans-Pacific flight in 1928. Cricketer Don Bradman shattered batting records, and a racehorse named Phar Lap won race after race and captured the nation's heart. World War II and the American pivot. When the Second World War erupted, Australia again committed forces across multiple theaters: Europe, North Africa, Burma, and the Pacific. This time, the war came home. Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin and other northern towns. Enemy submarines operated in Australian coastal waters and even launched a raid on Sydney Harbour in June 1942. The experience forced a strategic rethink. Australia could no longer rely solely on Britain, geographically too distant to defend it when it mattered most. The wartime alliance with the United States shifted Australia's diplomatic center of gravity westward, away from London and toward Washington. Reinvention in the post-war era. The post-war decades reshaped Australia dramatically. Tens of thousands of migrants arrived from war-ravaged Europe in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, seeking fresh starts. Their numbers made the White Australia policy economically and politically untenable, and it was progressively dismantled. These newcomers filled factories, built infrastructure, and helped fuel an extended economic boom. Australia emerged as a magnet for people wanting a better life, prosperous, stable, distant from the world's flashpoints. Its involvement in the Vietnam War during the 1960s and 70s was a notable exception, triggered by its closer alignment with American foreign policy. At home, the conversation increasingly turned to confronting colonial injustice. Reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples became a central political and moral question. Efforts to acknowledge historical wrongs, restore land rights, and address generational disadvantage moved to the forefront of national life. The country the world wants to visit. The opening of the Sydney Opera House in 1973 announced Australia's arrival as a cultural force on the world stage. The 2000 Sydney Olympics showcased the country to a global audience and cemented its reputation as one of the planet's most desirable destinations. Today, Australia stands as living proof that transformation is possible, that a land once used as a place of punishment can, through extraordinary effort, conflict, sacrifice, and reinvention, become a place millions dream of calling home. Feel free to ask if you'd like any section shortened, expanded, or adapted for a specific platform like YouTube,